This program is brought to you by Emory University.
The thrust of the book is basically asking what would it mean to focus rather than on the best interests of the child, on the best love of the child, not to deny the importance of best interest or even generally the language of the rights of the child, but to correct it a bit with a different emphasis where the first right is not, say, the right to health care or food, shelter, all the important things. But the first right is the right to be loved and in turn to be taught how to love. What would public policy, what would theology, what would psychology look like if we acknowledge that right and that central responsibility? I think autonomy has a very important place, but you grow into autonomy by being given love and being taught to love even before you have autonomy, right? You're not just born full-blown from the head of Zeus as a rational agent. You have to be schooled into choice, and you have to be given a love when you're utterly needy as a child, when you're utterly dependent. And I think we're sometimes wary to let that reality seep into our political consciousness. We talk so much about justice as central to politics and the good society, and so it is. It's certainly very central. But it's not the only good, and arguably even not the primary good. Why? Because again, we only become citizens capable of choice, capable of pursuing interests, if somebody has given us an unearned care when we're very young that engages our needs and potentials. Several of the pieces do raise the question of what is the implication of all this for public policy. Don Browning in particular, again, the book is dedicated to Don. Don wrestles with what it means to take seriously the best love of the child for family structure. And he argues on the basis of social psychological data that it is still the case that a two-parent male-female household intact is the ideal place to raise a child, to school it again into both the receipt of love and the giving of love. Margaret Brennig and Don Browning defend the idea of a two-parent heterosexual family as the ideal state. You know, there are those who would dissent from that, but that's part of the debate, and I'm certainly clear that this isn't going to resolve it with finality. But there are individuals that make proposals about what they think would be the best sort of familial structure and then how the law should promote this. Of course, Emory's own Martha Fineman is one that Don Browning really engages. Martha Fineman is less inclined to privilege traditional marriage as the setting for promoting the interests of either spouse or child. Michael Broyd talks about the Jewish tradition. Interestingly, he titles his piece, "What's Love Got to Do with It?" But as I note in my introduction, I think Michael's saying basically Jewish law does not require you to love your child in the sense of have a kind of preferential affection for it. I think he's really talking about what I would call eros, but it does expect caregiving in what the Judaic tradition might call chesed, sort of steadfast love. You may not like your child, but you're still required to care for them and to raise them into virtue. How do you teach love? You begin not by saying simply you must love, but you must love because God has already loved you. That the first step is taken by a grace that meets you where you are and all your need without merit. You are able to love because God first loves you, and there's, in a sense, a duty of gratitude and a natural inclination to respond to that. How do you teach it? I think, again, the paradox is you only learn to love by first being loved and receiving it. What about those who don't sense a love of God or do not receive love even from their parents or sort of surrogate caregivers? What about those who are so abused early on in life that they may be rendered incapable of loving? I think that's a deep question of justice, a deep question around the justification of God, and in theistic terms, again, the problem of evil. I know some are optimistic enough to think that you can never fully squelch the human capacity for love, that even in the worst of circumstances, sometimes people thrive and show remarkable capacity to forgive. If we fail to love, if we fail to engage the need and potential of our children, some of them may be so stunted that they will not have that basic right to love in turn. So it means, a very grave and earnest responsibility. Like many academic books, we hope that it would reach, say, a college audience or a graduate school audience of students. That said, I'd also like to think that it would be useful to psychologists, family counselors, and also professors of law and lawyers who are actually kind of on the ground handling family law cases. I'd like to read from the general introduction to The Best Love of the Child, the section beginning, "The right to be loved and the duty to become loving." Jesus Christ associated the kingdom of God with the humility of children, Matthew 18, 3-4, while La Rochefoucauld called youth, quote, "a continual drunkenness, the delirium of reason." William Wordsworth recollected his childhood as bearing, quote, "the glory and freshness of a dream," while William Golding saw his as, quote, "a sickness that you grow out of," unquote. Some medieval Japanese Buddhists saw birth as, quote, "being induced into what is profane and bit by bit leaving a sacred dimension." Thus they saw children as possessing, quote, "a positive kind of unworldliness," unquote. In contrast, some Puritan clerics saw children as willful and fallen creatures who need to be disciplined, even broken by their parents and or the church. Thus, I write, has the child oscillated as a cultural icon representing innocence and opportunity, something to be venerated and or recaptured, but also embodying neediness and instability, something to be lamented and or overcome. This ambivalence is as old as Herod's paranoia and Joseph's magnanimity before the Christ child. It finds modern expression in extremes ranging from predation on anonymous children, Andre Chikatilo and Wayne Williams, to murdering one's own offspring, Joseph Goebbels, Susan Smith, to caring for the offspring of others, Father Flanagan and Angelina Jolie, to risking one's life to save children unknown to you, Irena Sendler and Sir Nicholas Winton as examples. Double-mindedness about the young has taken an especially telling and I would say troubling form in recent American jurisprudence. Between 1976 and 2005, 22 juveniles who killed were tried as adults and executed in the United States. In 2005, the Supreme Court ruled that offenders under the age of 18 are different and that capital punishment is cruel and unusual in their cases and thus unconstitutional. Such is the depth and complexity of youth and our attitudes towards it. We're clearly quite ambivalent. One can only marvel at a phase of human life that's so protean and elusive that it calls up such different reactions. The assumption of this collection, this volume, is that it's precisely because the child is simultaneously strong and weak, wise and foolish, beautiful yet unfinished, that he or she is our best and deserves our best. But what constitutes optimal treatment for the young, again, that's the burden of this volume to try to answer that question.